coming to you for lesson 1 of your remote learning whilst you're off isolating. So over the next week or so, you're going to be sent some recordings, some video links to the English Department's YouTube channel with revision videos for Stave 1. So this is the first lesson of 3, 4?
Yeah, I think
yeah.
so.
Okay. So we're just reviewing Stave 1 and revisiting it because your assessment after half term is going to be on Scrooge. So we're looking at how does Dickens present Scrooge as a character and what he wants his readers to learn from his characterisation. Okay. So in today's lesson, we're going to be focusing on the presentation of Scrooge and what his characterisation tells Victorian readers about people like him. So at this point, obviously, there's nothing really much happened. Novel's just begun. We've learnt that Marley's dead, and Scrooge is now on his own 7 Christmas Eves later. So we're literally about to meet Ebenezer for the first time. And as you've already studied in class, you know that he's presented in a very negative way. And this is probably done by Dickens to highlight Dickens's own dislike of the selfish Victorian upper class and what he's trying to teach his readers, who again would have been Victorian and rich and probably in the upper class, about what they should be doing rather than what they currently are doing. So in particular then, if you ever get a question on Scrooge or the idea of redemption or change, his characterisation at the very start of the novella is really important to track that change throughout. Okay? So Miss Wan's going to read you the extract.
Yeah, it's my turn today. But he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in his dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him, no wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the known ones call nuts to Scrooge.
Well read, this one. Brilliant. Okay, so we're just going to look at a couple of quotes for each video, just not to overload you, and make sure that you've got analysis of key moments. Remember, you don't have to remember every single thing that's ever said in the novella, but focusing on small key quotes is going to be beneficial when you come to analyse. Okay, so Miss Wan's going to do hard and sharp as flint.
Okay, so year 10s. Like Miss Harrison said, we have looked quite in depth about the presentation of Scrooge. So we're just zooming in on a couple of quotes. The one I've chosen is the simile hard and sharp as flint. And I really want us to sort of focus on the noun flint. So if you don't remember, flint is a type of stone that was used to basically start fires. And so this we can use as an alternative Before we go into that, we could look at the description of the adjectives hard and sharp, which link to Scrooge's personality. So when we look at the adjective hard, we can think about this idea of it being impenetrable. So nothing can sort of transform Scrooge. He's quite hardened to the world. He's quite emotionless, and this idea of also being inflexible with change. So this does link in quite well to how he's been described in this introduction, because it also links to the idea of him being quite cold, I guess, and these qualities being problematic for Dickens because it is this emotionless personality or characteristics that form the construct of the upper classes who he feels are hardened to the plight of the poor. However, the alternative you could zoom in with this idea is the idea of the flint, which, yes, is a hard textured item in itself, but this idea that there is a potential for Scrooge to warm up, and we can contrast that with the description of the cold as well. In this introduction, the cold within him froze his old features, the frosty rime on his head, and there's this idea that there is a potential to change. And I think later on, when we read the novella and the ghosts act as that catalyst, so a catalyst is something that forms a change in Scrooge because they sort of help transform him. They take him to certain parts of Victorian London, they take him to his past, they take him to his future, and all of this is formative in order to strike that fire within Scrooge. I was talking to Miss Harrison about further alternatives, and she also taught me a point about the flint also being at the end of an arrow. I don't know whether you could sort of develop that.
Yeah. So flint, a piece of flint was also used on the point of an arrow. So it's this idea that obviously if an arrow hits you, it can either injure you or in extreme circumstances kill you. So this is reflective of the fact that Scrooge's personality and his characterization in the beginning has the ability to either harm people or in serious instances kill them. So you could link that to in stave 4, when the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come shows him that Tiny Tim will die if Scrooge doesn't change. So that's another alternative. And obviously, you know, everyone around him doesn't like him. Again, in stave 4, when he asks the spirit if he can show him a tenderness connect to a death, he shows him a couple who are rejoicing over the fact that Scrooge is dead. So it's kind of how his personality and attitudes not only inflict pain and cause suffering in other people, but if he doesn't change those ways, they will inflict pain and suffering on himself.
Yeah, and I think actually being described as similarly hard and sharp as flint, but it does hold negative connotations. I think it's this idea that Dickens presents such a horrible character that does eventually transform, that it provides hope for other people if they are willing to change and take the social responsibility. And so this is why we've got maybe the most miserly of people introduced at the start. And the idea of the flint, then, the alternative there, where it shows you that sort of glimmer of hope, similar to if you were going to analyse solitary as an oyster, because you're going to try and pick out those patterns. And so they both hint at this idea that Scrooge can change, but there is somebody or something that needs to strike that change within him. I think that's ready to move on to next. Cool.
Right, so the next quote that we're going to do is later on in the extract, where again, this is about Scrooge's interactions mainly just in the streets of Victorian London. So it says earlier on that no beggars implored him to bestow a trifle, so it's not an actual an eating trifle. A trifle is just a small amount of something. And then it says that the blind men's dogs tugged their owners into alleyways so that they didn't have to come into contact with him. And this is imagining, Dickens kind of imagining what the guide dog would say to the blind man. And that is, no eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master. So obviously you can see this repetition of the noun eye, and blindness is a huge motif that comes up all the way through the novella. The reference to the fog, particularly in stave 1, is to do with this, the fact that Scrooge is metaphorically blind to all the problems in society. And it's not just that he's blind, but it's kind of like an evil blindness. So it's not that he literally can't see, it's that he chooses to ignore the problems that don't affect him, because his life is rosy and he's got money, so that's all that matters. The blind man's dog is essentially saying to his owner, it's better to be literally blind than metaphorically, and kind of, it's this idea as well. You can even link this to the idea of ignorance and want later on in stave 3. The ignorance in society, and ignorance and want are allegories used by Dickens. So kind of like physical metaphors to show the problems in society. And he says, this girl is ignorance, this boy is ignorance, this girl is want. And he says, beware them both, but most of all the boy, so ignorance. So Dickens is highlighting the ignorance in society, and kind of turning a blind eye to the problems that don't affect you will essentially almost be the downfall in society. And that, you know, nothing good can come of ignorance and turning a blind eye. And then this reference to dark master, I think you could take one of two ways. Obviously, the blind man is kind of kept in the dark, literally, by the fact that he can't see. But you could also take that a step further and kind of link it to Scrooge, I think. The fact, obviously, the adjective dark has this idea of Scrooge being quite a dark character in the beginning. And again, how his metaphorical blindness is kind of not only obviously keeping him in the dark metaphorically, but also keeping his life in the dark. So we've got this juxtaposition all the way through, particularly in stave 2, between light and dark. So obviously dark is negative, light is positive, and the light in stave 2, as shown by the Ghost of Christmas Past, is this idea of hope or redemption. So it's this idea that Scrooge can come out of that darkness and transform into a better character as the ghosts kind of move him through his trajectory, and like Miss Wan's already said, catalyse this idea of change in him. Is that?
Was a very good interpretation. I was going to try and mention the light, but you jumped in and carried on with that. That was really good. Like on a sort of, if we reflect on that quote, because it says no eye at all is better than an evil eye, right? Because I always think, this is just me thinking about it, I always just think about eyes linking to clarity. So I don't know if I agree with, if this is what the dog said to the like blind man, because it might be better than an evil eye, like this idea of being ignorant, but we all do need to have clarity. So do we agree with this quote? Like, this is the thing, because it says no eye at all. If that's a metaphor for being able to see clearly, is that true? I don't know.
Maybe we can leave that up to the students.
Yeah, that's what, yeah. So I just want to think, and I think actually, you know, you do pay close attention to the motif of light from stave 2, and in particular the weather at the end in stave 5.
Yeah.
So Miss Harrison did mention fog in stave 1, and you can get questions on setting, and use of pathetic fallacy does link to Scrooge's transformation. So when you sort of go to stave 5, I'm pretty sure there's loads of references to warmth and sunlight in particular. And I think this links to Scrooge's outlook on life has become more, his clarity is much more clear, and that is because of what he's learned from the ghosts visiting and this hope for redemption, like we said, for all, even Scrooge.
Sorry, miss, I've just found the quote. So in stave 5, obviously we've talked about the reference to fog, and earlier in the extract we read about the cold, bleak, biting weather. So in stave 5, it says, no fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring, cold piping for the blood to dance to, golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet, fresh air, merry bells, oh, glorious, glorious. So there's huge, obviously, contrast between the weather that's referred to in stave 1 as opposed to stave 5. And again, if we think about fog as a metaphor for the metaphorical blindness in society, and more particularly with Scrooge, because there's no mist, no fog, there's this, again, like Miss Wan said, this idea of clarity, that his eyes have been opened and that he can see clearly not only the sufferings of the poor, but also it's kind of that he is seeing himself and what he needs to do in order to alleviate that suffering. And
that's sort of supported with the actions of him sort of finding Tiny Tim and buying the turkey and
raising Bob's wages.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think it's really important for us to consider whether, and also one final point about the presentation of Scrooge, I think it's highly unlikely that they'll go as easy as how is Scrooge presented.
Yeah.
So like Miss Harrison said, you're looking at words like redemption. Okay, so how does someone sort of become a better person and from learning? Transformation, which also is just another word for change. Responsibility.
Yeah.
So I think you just need to make sure that you understand those themes, because Scrooge can be added, can be mentioned, can't he? That's it really, before we move on to Marley. I think, because we've already done charity, we've mixed it up a little bit. So Marley, and that'll be the end of stave 1. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening, guys. I hope it's helpful.
Gosh, yours is really good. I stumbled a little bit. I can edit it.